Dzień dobry. I hope I said that right. Took me 24 hours to get here. What a lovely trip. Good morning. Thank you so much for invitation. It's a pleasure and a privilege here to be able to present to you this morning. I'll run through with you some of the experiences that I see is what's happening in the industry. I'll share with you many countries across Asia Pacific and Europe, what's happening, in their country from a government and from a private sector perspective, right? So we hear a lot of nice words like we are living in the most, transformational time of human history, that we in the next 20 years human progress will exceed the last 200 years. We hear about lots of promising technologies that lots of governments and private enterprise see as opportunities. In the digital world, we hear about digital economies. Thailand sees their country as 60% of their GDP will come from the digital economy. We hear a lot of things like by the end of this year, 90% of corporations will have some part of their applications or infrastructure in the cloud. We hear things like in the next 3 years, 25 billion IoT devices will be connected around the world. In the next 5 years, 500 million new applications will be introduced out there in the world. And in the next 10 years, there'll be a 1 trillion code of lines written in the next 10 years. So what does that mean for corporations? What does that mean for you and I? And now, I'll run through some examples. Right, so there are 3 things that I'll share with you today. One is modernization, which is what countries, governments, and private enterprises, how do they view modernization, and how does it help human progress or their businesses? So I'll give you examples. With obviously cloud, robotics, IoT, blockchain, artificial intelligence, deep learning, et cetera, right? So for example, robotics. Japan, a lot of manufacturing in Japan. Japan also have, if you don't know, the oldest population over 55 years. That means they don't have enough young people that would take over the jobs of the people who are retiring. That's a fact. And as such, a lot of the companies now are going very, very big into robotics, right? So they're building robots that will be helping doctors in the hospitals. They are building robots that will help, people, old people, for example, living at home will have a robot that will care for them, right? If they fall over, the robot will go and call the ambulance to come and help that individual, right? So robotics is not an option for Japan. They just don't have enough population to replace the workers that they have in their country. In India, if you're not aware, this was the single largest IT project in the world. The Indian government looked at biometrics technology as a way of identifying their citizens. You have a country with close to 1.4 billion citizens, of which 30% of that civilian population, they have their babies out in the village, not in a hospital. So they don't have birth certificates. They don't even know 30% of their population don't have any form of identification. So how do they go about making sure that their population have access to government services? And so they started the UID project, Unique Identifier Project, where they went across the country and using biometrics for eyes and fingerprinting, they now have it. We were helping them. They were registering 1 million citizens a day, which meant it still took a very long time to get 1.4 billion into their database. But now they've completed it, And every citizen in India now can just walk up to any government services. They want to go to the hospital, and all they need is scan their eyes. There's not even a card required. They just scan their eyes and their fingerprints, and they get access to government services. So what a great achievement, in terms of human progress for a country that has a problem or a challenge when you have 1.4 billion citizens that you need to take care of. Hong Leong Bank is a bank in Malaysia. They are the third largest bank. They realize that they really cannot become the largest bank, because the largest bank in Malaysia is twice the size of Hong Leong Bank. However, they believe that they can be the #1 bank in Malaysia when it comes to online and mobile banking. So that is their approach. They have now adopted technologies, and the way they're marketing it is they are the safest bank when it comes to online and mobile banking. And they believe with this approach, they will be the #1 bank in Malaysia from an online and mobile banking perspective. Just about 3 weeks ago, Saudi Arabia, who is a country that is trying to improve their image worldwide, so they've introduced new laws, one of which is that women can drive. Yay! Women can travel without a chaperone, etc., etc., etc. Right? They want to improve their image, and they want to bring more tourists into Saudi Arabia. And in fact, they just released this literally 3 weeks ago, and we work with them for an e-visa portal, so that with you go online, 3 simple steps, and you can get an e-visa to now travel to Saudi. And they believe the king of Saudi believes that over the next 10, 15 years, that 10% of their GDP will be from tourism, and this is the start of their initiative for this country. So, as we said, so the wonderful examples of human progress of modernization comes malice, right? There are bad things that are happening out there. We see an increase in that. I recently checked RSA's quarterly report on phishing, for example. Poland, for example, 2% of global phishing happens in Poland. Right? This is just the last quarter. We release this report every quarter, so you can just download it if you're interested. But it has been increasing. It used to be about 1%, and it's now gradually grown to 2% of global phishing attacks. So your companies, your governments here, there's an increase in terms of phishing attacks in your country here. So this is a customer we have in Australia. Is one of the largest mining company worldwide. And if you're not aware, that big truck that you see there is now driverless. It's controlled out of a command center. We work with the chief risk officer, and obviously they did it for efficiency, productivity, cost savings. But now the CISO, he tells me, Matthew is his name, what keeps him awake at night, if somebody hacks into this big truck, this truck is the size of a house, you can't stop it, right? So he's worried that what if somebody hacks into it and weaponize, one of my huge trucks, there's really nothing, what can we do to stop this truck if somebody, so new problems when you introduce new technologies, right? This is a company. This is not a very big company, small, medium-sized company in Australia. They make a very popular metal detector that they sell in the marketplace. And one of their, executives traveling in China used the hotel Wi-Fi, and the blueprint for their metal detectors was hacked and stolen. As a result, they started receiving metal detectors into their customer support centers, and then they realized they didn't build these metal detectors. They were exact replicas of their metal detectors that had been introduced into the market. As a result, they had to reduce the cost of their metal detectors, and they went from $45 million in profit down to $9 million in just 1 year as a result of this hack or stolen IP. Steel company, they're very competitive. U.S. big in steel. Japan, I think have the second largest steel company in the world, and they developed a new metal that was going to be lighter, more malleable, that could be used in various manufacturing, including car manufacturing, and obviously they spend a lot of money in R&D. And the last thing that they need is to somebody to hack and steal their IP, and then they start competing with them in the marketplace, right? And in this example, a company in China suddenly introduced a similar steal technology into the marketplace, right? Undercutting the pricing of the development of this, right? In Korea, Samsung is a big customer of us. For example, TVs. Do you know how much Samsung would spend in R&D to develop the next generation of TV? Right, we've seen them from, LCD, LEDs. They spend probably $800 to $900 million in R&D, just so we get the next versions or the next beautiful TVs that we want to buy for our homes. They have a very big security team because their advantage is first to market, right? They get to market that technology first, reap the reward so that we buy their TVs first before their competitors, introduce their own similar, TVs out there. So the last thing they need is for somebody to steal their IP because they have just, pumped in $800 to $900 million worth on R&D, right? They lose all that advantage if their IP is stolen. We talk about governments as well. So Australian Bureau of Meteorology, which basically tells us the weather patterns in Australia, but a lot of military or Department of Defense in Australia has links to Bureau of Meteorology. So they also, we believe that when hackers hacked into the Bureau of Meteorology, it's not to find out data on the weather. They're trying to see if they can actually move laterally, and get into the military defenses that also have, connections to data from the Bureau of Meteorology, right? So the third party is a very, very big deal and a challenge as well for a lot of organizations. And of course, recently with the American, elections, digital voting, there's now a lot of data that shows that perhaps nation states had hacked into their DNC. DNC is the group that actually in charge of the digital voting, and they're now saying that they were hacked into, and as such data was stolen that they can now use to, I guess, put news in the media to try and subterfuge candidates in the U.S. Right? As a result of this is now in the U.S. It wasn't, but now this system is now part of the critical infrastructure, right? This is now part of the critical infrastructure, which means we need to take care of it to make sure that it is protected. France, as a result, is pulling away from electronic voting. Netherlands as well, and now everybody is very, very worried that this could be manipulated if it's not taken care of. OPM in the U.S., there are so many examples. I guess I won't go through them all. We sort of know that when it's a nation-state attack, when we don't see the stolen data in the dark web. Right? So when we see a company get hacked and we see that data being sold off in the dark web, we know that it was criminals who want to steal that data, make money from it. But there are many examples where data has been stolen, we don't see it in the dark web, which means what are they using that data for, right? And so we are waiting to see what happens, in terms of this data. And this is critical data. This is government officials. This is the department that keeps all government official personal records. Whether you're sick, whether you have a gambling problem, who your family, who your close contacts are, what your job is with the government is all kept here, and it was, a lot of it was stolen, which is not very, very good, right? So, and then lastly, universities. We mentioned about universities are the breeding ground for a lot of startups. They do a lot of research and development, come up with new ideas. They share it all around the world, right? They're one of the biggest users of the internet and certainly collaborate with universities around the world. And recently, we believe about 176 universities were hacked into. All this IP research data was stolen. And we believe there's a few people that they are currently being chased by the FBI, right? 31 terabytes of data that we think is worth $3 billion. So why is this increasing? Well, I think we also mentioned, right? Maybe 3-4 years ago, if you wanted to be a criminal, the industry that you want to be in that makes the most money for criminals was selling drugs, right? Because drugs around the world is about $500 billion a year industry. You want to make money, sell drugs. But in the last 3 years, cybercrime, I think the last report I read, is now about $600 billion a year and increasing, at some stage hitting $1 trillion. So this is very lucrative, right? Until governments work together, come up with international policies, because right now it's very hard to prosecute when we can help companies find out where the hacking is coming from, which country, which individual. It's very hard to prosecute because there's no international collaborative laws. Right, so the third thing that when I talk to CEOs, CIOs, and board of directors, so number one, top of their mind is modernization, right? They are adopting new technologies. Number two is cybersecurity, because they know that with adopting new technologies, there are risks. And the number three, biggest concern they have is mandates, which is new regulations that are being introduced. If I look back 5 years ago, I look at Asia Pacific and I look at EMEA, many of the cybersecurity policies, many of the data privacy policies had been in place for 2, 3, 4, 5, in some countries even 8 years. They have not changed, right? But over the last 3 years, governments have been trying to catch up and have been introducing a lot of new regulations around the world, right? So in this part of the region, there's GDPR, there's PSD2. In Australia, they've released new mandatory breach policies. So mandatory breach policies. There are many countries, for example, in Asia Pacific, if you as a company get hacked, you didn't even have to tell the government, and you didn't even have to tell your customers that you were hacked. Right? So many countries introduce mandatory breach policy, and in some countries, you have 3 days to notify the government. In some countries, you have 1 day to notify the government. My esteemed colleague mentioned Singapore, Smart Nation, came out with new cybersecurity law. In Singapore, you have 1 hour to notify the Singapore government if you think you have been breached. 1 hour. Right? So different countries, different sort of rules and guidelines. Data privacy, right? GDPR is data privacy, right? And we believe GDPR is just step one. There will be more that will come out from the EU when it comes to data privacy. In the Philippines, for example, they also just introduced their, or updated their data privacy law. So in terms of penalties, right? Not only will you get penalties, in the Philippines, if you are a company and you lose your customer data, it is a criminal act and you can go to prison. And depending on the severity of that breach, It can be from 2 years to 7 years in prison as an executive if you don't take care of your customers' private data. So it's getting more and more serious around the world. This is an example just in Australia in the last 2 years. So previously, Australian government sort of came out with new regulations so every 2 or 3 years. This is just in the last 2 years. They've come out with multiple amendments and new guidelines to try and catch up to what's happening in the world in terms of breaches, in terms of privacy, across industries, banking, telco, et cetera, right? So I think that that's the trend. The trend is more and more governments is going to introduce more and more regulations for organizations, and guidelines for organizations that they need to take care of. So this one is just recently, right, with GDPR. Prior to GDPR, the maximum fine for data breach is £500,000, and you get a discount of 20% if you pay early. And the first company that got, I guess, whacked is British Airways, where they got fined $183 million for losing about 500,000 of their customer data. So this is big. This is a big difference from $500,000 to $183 million, right? Which is about 1.5% of the company's global turnover. And GDPR can actually fine you up to 4%. So it could have been a lot higher. Now, the second part of it is, on top of this fine, GDPR allows the customers to sue British Airways for losing their data. So you could potentially have now, apart from this $183 million, 500,000 customers of British Airways all suing British Airways to say, I'm suing you for losing my private data. So it's going to get worse if companies don't take care of it, right? The second example was Marriott breach as well recently. So what does ours say? What do we think? What insight can I share with you, right? So most organizations, as we said, right, you have IT, which is looking at new disruptive technologies that they're looking at introducing to be competitive in this new digital world. Most companies now have created a security team to look at cybersecurity. And of course, they have a risk management team that looks at all those new regulations that they have to comply with. As they go, and adopt, digital technologies, the risk goes up, and these are all new digital risks that companies do not have to worry about previously that they now have to worry about. So the challenge here that we see for most organizations is that these three groups within the company work in silos, and as such, there are gaps, and the company do not get a holistic view of the risk. So each of these risks is relevant. However, from what we see is that they need to be able to collaborate, right, as an organization to get a holistic view of business-driven security, right? We call it business-driven security, or we call it an integrated risk management platform, so that they have a holistic view of everything that's happening all the way up to the board. And if they can create a roadmap and a strategy around collaborating these three very important parts of the organization, they will get a holistic view of the threats to their business. What happens if I lose a particular IP or one of my guys got hacked, their identification got hacked? What does that mean from a business context? And we can help organizations do this. We believe that all the promises of digital transformation, that we don't need to fear the risk that comes with it, right? The reality, I think, is, and all the examples that I've given, very big companies, very big governments are being hacked. I don't think we can stop breaches from happening. But I believe that with the right controls and the right strategy, we do not we do not have to fear, hackings from happening as long as we know what's happening to the business, the priorities we need to look at, and how we can respond, for our customers in terms of, making sure that their business is minimized from a breach perspective.
Nigel,
Yeah.
thank you so much.